The 7 habits are interrelated, interdependent, and sequential. On this side, Stephen describes how the 7 habits can help us progress from a state of dependence to a state of interdependence.
Now, my friends, we're going to move into the second part. We have defined basic habits, and we have defined effectiveness. And those two definitions were very important before we approach the 7 habits. I'm going to give an overview of these 7 habits on what I call a maturity continuum. A maturity continuum basically ranges at the low end from dependency up at the upper end to interdependency. The middle position is called independency. Now let's define each of those terms for a moment. Dependency is the attitude of you. You take care of me. You come through for me. You didn't come through. I blame you for these results. The attitude of independency is I. I can do it. I will. Yes. No. I won't. I prefer. Self-reliance. Takes self-confidence to be self-reliant. The attitude or word symbol of interdependency is we. We can do it. We will do it. We'll cooperate. We'll accomplish this. Dependent people need others to get what they want. Independent people can get what they want through their own effort. Interdependent people require their own effort and the cooperation of others to get what they want. It doesn't take much thought, really, to realize how much more mature interdependency is than independency. Also, it doesn't take much thought to realize you cannot really be interdependent, that is, the we attitude, the team spirit, the cooperation spirit, until you are first independent. That's why independence is such a major achievement, so that people are not being victimized by other people. For instance, let's say I'm emotionally and financially dependent upon you. You're my supervisor, you're my boss, you're my father, you're my teacher at school, whatever the situation may be. My grade, my promotions, my salary, a function of your judgment. And also my sense of worth comes from you. If I'm very dependent that way, would I be a good cooperative team member? Would I give you feedback about some of the things we need to do to improve this operation? Or feedback about your own blind spots? All a blind spot is a hidden weakness. We're all aware of our weaknesses, but blind spots are far more tender. We protect ourselves from those areas, and sometimes they're crippling to us in our effectiveness. And we need feedback. But dependent people will not give that feedback. They cannot risk that kind of vulnerability. They cannot risk possibly compromising their career path. So they won't do it. They'll badmouth and bad think instead. I'll tell you another reason they won't give feedback. They're too angry. They're too upset. And they know if they were to express themselves with that spirit, it would disrupt the relationship. They can't risk that. They're too dependent upon the other person. So they cannot be interdependent because they are not yet independent. If a person was financially independent, that doesn't mean they're financially wealthy at all. Some wealthy people are financially very dependent upon their wealth. And if the wealth is lost or devalued for some reason, they're wiped out. But a financially independent person is one who has so many skills and such capacity. There are many options that they could take for employment. They are capable of producing a livelihood for themselves and for their loved ones in many different ways. So they're not running scared of a boss's opinion. And they can be empathic and kind and also direct and forthright and courageous because they're independent. Emotionally, their sense of worth does not come from other people's opinions. It comes basically from within themselves, from intrinsic sources of personal security. Fundamentally, it comes from their integrity to their own value system. So they're more independent. I'll tell you one of the clearest ways to tell whether you and I are dependent is to study anger. Anger and fear, really, both reveal dependency. Whatever makes me angry or I'm fearful of reveals my dependency. Oh, it makes me so mad. You cannot believe what I do. Look how that person's weakness is controlling my behavior. Look how dependent I am. How many of us have a tendency to come back defensively when we're being unjustly dealt with or attacked? It's a natural tendency. How many of us do better when we're treated better? Most of us do. We're very dependent upon the external environment. What if we could carry inside of us enough inward security that we are a function of our values rather than of the conditions, physical or social, that we may encounter? What if we could carry our own weather with us? What if our life was almost totally a product of our value system? Think how independent we could become and how effective we could become, because one of the values we treasure is to be effective with other people, not just to be right and isolated and independent. We want to be interdependent because the very nature of life is interdependent. Think of what we learn in the field of ecology. I just recently read an article on what happens when the rainforests in the South American continent are depleted, the effect that has upon weather and upon vegetation and animal life and humankind elsewhere. Many people are speculating about this hole in the ozone layer, the thinning of it, the bad air, the bad water that can come when people violate ecological principles. Everything is related to everything else, like the domino effect. We are highly interdependent beings, but we can only achieve interdependence if we first become independent to a very high degree, emotionally, intellectually, financially, and physically. I would say physically is the least important. A person can be very handicapped and require other people to help him or her through life physically, but still be intellectually, emotionally, financially extremely independent.
Stephen continues his discussion of the maturity continuum by explaining why habits 1, 2, and 3 are basically character habits that enable us to move from dependency to independency.
I've got to tell you a study I made for a bicentennial study. I made it in 1976 and studied the success literature in this country over a 200-year period from 1776. I became fascinated. It got me literally into hundreds, even thousands of books. And I could clearly see a fundamental shift taking place in this success literature. I'm talking about the success literature that's popular in the magazines and the books. For the first 150 years in this country, almost the entire thrust and theme of the success literature was character. Character. Characteristics of the person. Basic habits such as industry, integrity, modesty, thoughtfulness, love, service, and so forth. Character, see? The last 50 years, the focus shifted to one that we might call the personality ethic, to differentiate it from the character ethic. It's heavily imbued by technique, technologies, how to lubricate the processes of human interaction, influence people, mental technologies, PMA, positive mental attitude, and other ways of organizing our life, our responses, so as to be effective with other people, without perhaps fundamentally dealing with our own character. These basic habits, these 7 basic habits, help us to move from dependency through independency up into interdependency. And the first 3 habits are basically character habits. Character habits. The next 3 habits are what you might call personality habits, the outward expression of this independent character. I'm not against the concept of the personality ethic. I'm in favor of it, as long as it is a natural, congruent outgrowth of character. But if, like an iceberg, the tip of it, being personality, is separated from, truncated from, the great mass of the iceberg underneath the water, what happens is people begin to develop a life pattern of habits that are manipulative and often deceptive. They work with hidden agendas, and they're heavy into techniques and quick fix ideas, ways of getting what they want now. And sometimes they're able to, and they can move from one field of endeavor to another. However, study any long-term relationship with those manipulators, those people that are taking withdrawals from the emotional bank account. Study any long-term relationship, and the natural principles being violated will expose the flaw in that personality approach. It'll expose it. They'll be found out, and then they often will pretend it and fake it for the public, but their private lives are often in shambles. And they know it, and their marriages and their family lives. It's a joke. They're not really independent. They're not interdependent. They're dependent. Or sometimes it's a counterfeit independency called counterdependency. They're in a state of rebellion. They're still being controlled by the thing that they need, only in a negative way. Like teenage kids sometimes may rebel against their parents, and the parents, looking at their behavior, may think, I have no influence with these kids. In fact, the parents are controlling those kids only in a negative way. They do the very opposite of what the parents want. It's called a counterdependency. It isn't true independency. To develop an independent character is a major achievement. Interdependence is the choice which independent people can make. Dependent people cannot choose to become interdependent. They don't have enough character strength inside themselves. They don't own themselves enough. They don't know who they are enough. They don't have a deep enough sense of self. They don't know what they stand for. They become almost like chameleons, that little animal that blends into whatever environment it's in. And the principle that runs their life is expediency, not integrity. And eventually, in long-term relationships, you'll see overdrawn emotional bank accounts. It's inevitable, particularly in times of stress, fatigue, times of storm. The shallowness of the root structure will be revealed. So I was very, very intrigued by that bicentennial study, and persuaded me to try to focus on the study of those habits that are fundamentally character habits. Habits 1, 2, and 3. And habits 4, 5, and 6 are the natural fruits of those character roots. They also become habits. They are the personality expressions of that character. They're congruent with it. All of us know from our experiences in school that you need to take some classes before you can take other classes. You need to study math before you can possibly understand algebra, and algebra before you can deal with calculus. We know that in farming we need to plant before we can harvest, with all of the intervening processes between. We know with our children that they learn to walk before they run, and they crawl before they walk. In nature, all things work in a sequence. And to me, one of the fundamental flaws with simplistic success formulas and human relations technologies is they do not respect that natural principle. It is futile to try to improve relationships without trying to improve ourselves. It is worthless and futile to try to develop new communication strategies and human relations techniques if fundamentally we're duplicitous and deceitful and lazy. Flaky people will be found out under stress and pressure, even though on the surface they might put on a very charming exterior. So I put a heavy emphasis on the sequencing of these habits. And by the way, these habits are the best research habits you'll find in all literature. And I'll tell you the best source for you to validate that. Examine your own lives. These habits are so self-evident that once you understand them, they're not arguable. You'll find as we go through these 7 habits, they're the very essence of the natural laws of life. All right, then, let's remember. Habits 1, 2, and 3 are habits of character that enable us to move from dependency to independency, a major achievement. Habits 4, 5, and 6 are habits of the outward expression of character in the relationship with other people. We could call that personality if you wish. That's the fruit. The fundamental habits are the roots.
Stephen next discusses habit 1, entitled Be Proactive, and explains why we must take individual responsibility for our own life and choices.